The laughter started before she even set down her bag. Clara Whitmore stepped off the stage into the gray Montana afternoon, her silk traveling dress already ruined by road dust, her coin purse holding exactly $4.30. The town of Harrow Creek spread before her in a single muddy street. There was a saloon, a general store, and a church with a crooked steeple. A crowd of men spilled out of the saloon door, looking like they'd been pushed. She heard the name first. Silas Blackwood. Then the laughter. Clara paused on the boardwalk and listened. Inside the saloon, a man's voice cut through the noise. It was low and unhurried, carrying the particular weight of someone who rarely repeated himself. I need a wife. Educated. Capable. Someone who can teach a child and manage a household. I'll provide legal protection, land rights, and a fair wage until the arrangement suits both parties. More laughter. Louder this time. Blackwood wants a schoolmarm, someone shouted. No woman with sense would step foot in that cold castle of yours, called another. Clara moved to the doorway. She had nowhere else to go. The letter in her coat pocket promised her a teaching position in Harrow Creek. But it had been written by a man who'd hired someone else 3 weeks ago, and simply forgotten to mention it. She had traveled 1,100 miles from Savannah on the strength of that letter. She had left behind a man named Gerald Holt, who believed her father's debts made her his property. She had nothing, and she had learned, in the last 6 months, that nothing was a surprisingly useful place to stand. The man at the bar was not what she expected. Silas Blackwood stood with his back half turned to the room, one hand resting on the bar, his posture carrying the stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his dark coat worn but clean. His face was angular, weathered, and entirely unmoved by the laughter surrounding him. He did not look like a man asking for help. He looked like a man completing a transaction. Clara stepped inside. The laughter continued. A man near the door, red-faced and enjoying himself, called out, "What kind of woman marries a man who can't even keep his first wife alive?" The room went quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Silas did not turn around. Clara set her bag down on the nearest table. She removed her gloves, one finger at a time. Then, she looked at the red-faced man. She wore the exact expression she had once used on students, the ones who thought cruelty was cleverness. "A man who asks for a mother for his child," she said clearly, her southern accent unhurried and precise, "is showing more character than every man in this room who's laughing at him. What exactly is shameful about that?" The room went fully silent. Silas Blackwood turned around. His eyes were dark gray, steady, and entirely unreadable. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected. There was no warmth or welcome, only the careful attention of someone recalculating. "You're not from here," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "I'm from Savannah. I have a teaching certificate, a letter of reference from the Georgia Ladies Academy, and $4.30. I understand you're looking for someone educated and capable." She held his gaze. "I'm listening to your terms." The saloon did not laugh again. The contract was signed in the land office 2 hours later, witnessed by the sheriff and the minister. It was practical and plain. Clara would manage the Blackwood household, educate his daughter, and maintain the ranch accounts. Silas would provide room, board, legal standing as his wife, and fund the construction of a schoolhouse on Blackwood land for the children of Harrow Creek. There was no mention of love. There was no pretense of it. Silas drove the wagon himself. They rode the 6 miles to Blackwood Ranch in near silence, the mountains rising ahead of them, the sky enormous and indifferent. Clara sat straight, her ruined dress stiff with dried dust, her hands folded in her lap. "Her name is Lily," Silas said finally, without looking at her. "She's 6. She doesn't speak." Clara waited. "She hasn't spoken since her mother died. The doctor says there's nothing wrong with her." She just stopped. "How long ago?" 2 years. Clara looked at the mountains. "What is she like?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Horses. Drawing. She draws on everything." "Then we'll start there," Clara said. Silas glanced at her sideways. He said nothing more. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road, larger than she'd expected, the main house built from dark timber, solid and severe against the treeline. A barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, outbuildings. Men paused in their work to watch the wagon come in. Their expressions ranged from curious to skeptical to openly amused. A woman named Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper, met them at the door. She was stout, gray-haired, and made no effort to hide her assessment of Clara. "Southern," she said, as if confirming a diagnosis. Yes, Clara said pleasantly. And I'd be grateful for a tour of the kitchen when you have a moment. Mrs. Hatch blinked. Then she stepped aside. Lily was in the parlor. She sat cross-legged on the floor with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of brown paper, drawing something with intense concentration. She did not look up when Clara entered. Clara did not crouch down or speak in the high, careful voice adults used with children they were trying to impress. She simply sat on the floor nearby, at a comfortable distance, and looked at the drawing. It was a horse. Detailed, accurate, the lines confident for a child's hand. That's very good, Clara said, as she would have said it to anyone. You got the legs right. Most people make them too short. Lily's charcoal paused. She did not look up, but she did not move away. Clara stayed on the floor for another 10 minutes, saying nothing more. When she finally rose to follow Mrs. Hatch to the kitchen, she felt Lily's eyes on her back. It was a beginning. That first night at Blackwood Ranch was a lesson in the immense, heavy silence of the West. In Savannah, the nights were alive with the predictable choreography of cicadas, the distant laughter from neighboring porches, and the heavy, humid scent of jasmine that clung to the velvet air. Here, the air was thin, sharp, and tasted of pine and impending frost. Clara stood by the window of her assigned bedroom, a small but clean space under the eaves. The room smelled of cedar and beeswax. Her single carpetbag sat on the cane-bottomed chair, looking pathetically small. She had spent the last hour scrubbing the travel grime from her face with cold water from a porcelain pitcher, her skin tingling from the harsh lye soap. When she blew out the candle, the darkness that rushed in was absolute. She lay beneath the heavy wool quilts, staring at the invisible ceiling, listening to the house settle. It was a sturdy house, built to withstand the temper of the mountains, but every timber seemed to groan with a secret. Down the hall, she heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of Silas Blackwood's boots. He walked with a deliberate pace, the sound muffled by a braided rug, before his bedroom door clicked shut. There was no sound of a lock turning. In this wilderness, trust wasn't a luxury, it was a structural necessity. A few hours later, the wind shifted, howling down from the peaks like something hunted. Clara woke with her heart hammering against her ribs. For a disorienting second, she thought she was back in Georgia, hearing Gerald Holt's carriage pulling up the gravel driveway to claim her father's estate. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. Slipping out of bed, her bare feet shrinking from the cold floorboards, she crept to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was bathed in a pale, ethereal wash of moonlight. As she watched, a tiny shadow moved near the top of the stairs. It was Lily. The little girl was wrapped in an oversized flannel nightshirt, her small toes curling against the wood. She wasn't crying. She was simply standing there, looking down into the dark well of the foyer, as if waiting for a ghost to appear. Clara remained perfectly still, holding her breath. She didn't want to startle the child, nor did she want to intrude on a grief she didn't yet understand. After a long moment, the door to Silas's room opened. He hadn't untucked his shirt, and his hair was uncombed, falling over his forehead in a way that made him look remarkably human. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt on the floor, extending one large, calloused hand. Lily didn't hesitate. She walked into his space, and Silas scooped her up against his broad chest, burying his face in her dark hair. He stood up and carried her back to her room, his movements fluid and practiced. Clara quietly closed her door, a strange ache tightening in her chest. Silas Blackwood was a man of iron and stone to the outside world, but in the dark, he was a father trying to hold together the broken pieces of his world. She lay back down, the coldness of the room suddenly less daunting. She was an outsider, yes, but this house possessed a fierce, quiet loyalty that she hadn't encountered in a very long time. The first week was an education in humility. Clara burned the biscuits twice. She knocked over a full bucket of milk, and spent an hour on her knees cleaning the kitchen floor, while Mrs. Hatch watched with the expression of a woman whose suspicions were being confirmed. She attempted to help mend a fence and drove a splinter so deep into her palm that one of the ranch hands had to remove it with a needle, while she sat very still and did not make a sound. Silas watched all of this without comment. He was not unkind. He was simply absent, present in the house but unreachable, moving through his days with the efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped expecting company. He ate breakfast before dawn. He returned after dark. He said good night at the foot of the stairs, and went to his room and closed the door. Clara told herself this was fine. This was the arrangement. She had not come here for warmth. But Lily was thawing. It happened slowly, in the way that real things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in accumulation. Clara read aloud in the evenings, not to Lily specifically, just in the parlor where Lily happened to be. She sang sometimes while she worked, old songs her grandmother had taught her, the kind that moved in a slow rhythm. She left paper and charcoal on the kitchen table, and never commented when drawings appeared. One morning she found a drawing of herself on the table. It was unmistakably her, the upswept hair, the straight posture, the southern dress. Lily had drawn her standing in the kitchen doorway looking out. Clara set it carefully on the mantelpiece. That afternoon, Lily sat beside her at the kitchen table, while Clara worked on the ranch accounts. Not close, but beside. The shift in Lily's behavior was not a sudden dam breaking, but rather the slow, deliberate melting of river ice under an early spring sun. It required patience, a quality Clara had cultivated during her years at the academy, where young ladies were taught to hide their minds behind embroidery frames. Here, Clara used that patience like a tool. Every afternoon, when the sun hit the western windows of the kitchen, turning the unpainted wood to gold, Clara would establish her camp at the table. She would spread out the ranch's leather-bound ledgers, her inkwell, and a stack of clean parchment. A few feet away, she placed a smaller piece of smooth pine board, a fresh stick of willow charcoal, and a small jar of water with a horsehair brush. For the first 3 days, Lily merely watched from the safety of the pantry doorway, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. On the 4th day, she took 2 steps forward. On the 5th, she sat on the very edge of the bench, her small knees pointing away from Clara, ready to bolt at the first sudden movement. Clara did not look at her. She kept her eyes firmly on the columns of figures, tracking the cost of winter feed and blacksmith fees. 7 bushels of oats, Clara murmured aloud, as if thinking to herself. And the bay mare requires 2 new front shoes. That's a total of $3.20. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Lily reach out a small, charcoal-stained hand. She picked up the brush, dipped it into the water, and began to work on the pine board. She wasn't drawing horses today. She was drawing a bird, a hawk with wide, sweeping wings, trapped in a storm of dark, heavy lines. "The wings are beautiful," Clara said softly, her voice maintaining the same even rhythm she used for the ledger numbers. "But it looks like he's having a difficult time flying through that wind. Do you think he needs a place to land?" Lily paused. She looked at Clara's profile, her dark eyes wide and searching, scanning the teacher's face for any sign of mockery or false praise. Finding none, she dipped the brush again. With 2 bold, wet strokes, she added a thick, solid tree branch beneath the bird's talons. "There," Clara said, turning a page in the ledger with a crisp snap. "A good branch makes all the difference when the wind gets high." From that moment on, their afternoon sessions became a silent dialogue. Clara began to introduce letters into the drawings. She would write the word horse at the top of a page, then leave it for Lily to find. The next day, Lily would return the paper with a perfect sketch of a stallion beneath the letters. One rainy afternoon, Clara decided to push the boundary just a fraction further. She took a piece of charcoal and drew a large, clumsy circle on a scrap of paper. Then, she handed the charcoal to Lily. "My hands are stiff from the cold today," Clara said, flexing her long fingers. "Would you help me finish the alphabet? My mother taught me that letters are just drawings that carry a voice." Lily stared at the charcoal in her hand. She looked at the clumsy circle Clara had drawn. Then, slowly, with an agonizing amount of concentration, she added a straight line down the right side of the circle, transforming it into a perfect, neat letter A. She looked up at Clara, a tiny spark of pride lighting up her pale face. Clara smiled, not a wide, exuberant grin, but a small, respectful nod of partnership. "Perfect," Clara said. "Tomorrow we will try the letter B." Silas came in for water and stopped in the doorway. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Clara. Something moved across his face, brief and unguarded, before he turned and went back out. Clara did not mention it, but she thought about it later, alone in her room, listening to the wind come down from the mountains. She thought about it more than she should have. The trouble with Harrow Creek arrived in the form of a man named Denton Marsh. He owned the second largest spread in the valley, and he had wanted Blackwood land for years. He was the kind of man who smiled with his teeth and watched with his eyes, and he had decided that Clara was a useful pressure point. It started with comments at the general store. "The Southern wife. Blackwood's charity case. Wonder how long before she runs back to her parlor." Then it became deliberate, a delivery of supplies turned away at the ranch gate. A rumor spread that Clara had been seen in conversation with a traveling salesman, the implication left to do its own damage. Clara heard the rumors on a Thursday. By Friday she had driven herself into town, tied the horse at the rail, walked into the general store, and addressed the 3 women gathered near the counter directly. "I understand there's been some talk," she said, her voice carrying the particular southern courtesy that was also, unmistakably, a warning. "I'd like to save everyone some time. I am here. I am staying. And I find that the most effective response to a lie is simply to be visible." She bought her supplies, thanked the storekeeper by name, and left. Silas heard about it that evening from 2 separate ranch hands before she mentioned it herself. "You didn't have to do that," he said. They were on the porch, the evening cooling around them, the mountains going dark against the sky. "I know," Clara said. "I wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. "Marsh won't stop." "I know that too." Silas looked at her. In the fading light his face was less guarded than usual, the hard lines of it softened slightly by something she couldn't name. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it honestly. Someone who needed more protecting. Clara almost smiled. "I need protecting from specific things," she said. "Gerald Holt and men like him. Not from gossip." It was the first time she had said the name aloud since arriving. She had not meant to. Silas went still. "Who is Gerald Holt?" Clara looked at the mountains. The story came out in pieces. She spoke of her father's debts. She told him about the arrangement Holt had considered a foregone conclusion. Finally, she described the morning she packed a single bag and took the first stage north. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she had learned to carry difficult things. When she finished, Silas said nothing for a long moment. "He knows where you are," he asked finally. "He will," Clara said. "Men like that always find out." Silas nodded once. He did not offer reassurance. He did not minimize it. He simply said, "All right," in a tone that meant something had been decided, and went inside. Clara sat on the porch a while longer. The stars came out one by one. She felt, for the first time since leaving Savannah, that she was not entirely alone with the problem. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling. She was careful not to trust it too quickly. The blizzard came in November, 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. The sky turned the color of iron by mid-morning. By noon the wind had teeth. Silas and 4 of his men had ridden out at dawn to move cattle from the high pasture, a 2-hour ride that would take longer coming back against the weather. Mrs. Hatch left for her sister's place in town before the worst of it hit, pressing Clara's hands and saying, "Keep the fires going and don't open the barn doors for anything." Clara kept the fires going. By mid-afternoon the storm was a wall of white. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it through the walls. Lily sat close to the parlor fire, her knees drawn up, her eyes on the window. She had not drawn anything all day. Clara heard the barn door. It was the wind, she knew that, but then she heard it again, a rhythmic banging, and she went to the window and saw that the latch had torn free. The barn door swung wide with each gust, and inside she could see the horses moving, agitated, the foals pressing against their mothers. Silas had a mare who had foaled 3 weeks ago. The foal was not yet strong enough for cold like this. Clara stood at the window for exactly 10 seconds. Then she put on every coat she could find, tied a rope from the porch rail to the barn door, and went out. The cold was a physical force. It hit her face like a flat hand and stole the breath from her lungs. She moved along the rope, hand over hand, the wind trying to take her sideways. The barn door slammed against her shoulder as she reached it, and she grabbed the frame and held on. Inside, the horses were wild-eyed and stamping. Clara moved through them the way she had watched Silas move, slowly, speaking low, her hands visible. She got the foal into the back stall with its mother, packed straw around them both, and latched every door she could reach. She found a broken board on the north wall and wedged a feed sack against it. She worked until her fingers stopped feeling the cold, which she understood was not a good sign. She made it back to the house on the rope. She did not remember sitting down. Silas came back 4 hours later, half frozen, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. He found the barn secure, the fires burning, and Clara unconscious on the kitchen floor with her coat still on, her temperature climbing. He carried her to her room. He sent the one ranch hand who'd made it back for the doctor, who couldn't come until morning. He sat beside her bed through the night, changing the cold cloths on her forehead, keeping the fire fed. Somewhere in the dark hours, his own fever came on. The cold had gotten into him too, deep and stubborn. He sat in the chair beside her bed and shook with it and did not leave. Clara woke near dawn. The room was warm. Silas was asleep in the chair, his head tipped back, his face slack with exhaustion and fever, looking younger than she had ever seen him. She got up carefully and found a blanket and put it over him. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and let herself feel, for a moment, everything she had been holding at arm's length since Savannah. She was still sitting there when Lily appeared in the doorway. The child looked at her for a long moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and climbed into the chair beside Clara and leaned against her arm. Clara put her arm around her and held on. The kitchen was a sanctuary of rising warmth as the wood stove finally conquered the residual chill of the blizzard. The smell of boiling coffee and frying salt pork began to fill the air, cutting through the sharp scent of liniment and sweat that clung to Clara's clothes. Lily remained anchored to Clara's side, her small cheek pressed against the rough wool of Clara's sleeve. Her breathing was deep and regular, her little fingers curled tightly into the fabric, as if she feared that if she let go, the lady from Savannah would vanish back into the white fury of the storm. Clara used her free hand to smooth the tangled curls away from Lily's forehead. She felt a profound, grounding sense of peace. For months, she had been a ghost in this house, moving through the rooms with a defensive grace, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But looking down at the child in her arms, and knowing the horses were safe in the barn, she realized she had stopped running. She had built a fortress here, out of nothing but willpower and firewood. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, heavy and uneven. Silas appeared in the doorway, supporting himself with one hand against the frame. He looked battered. His face was pale beneath the winter burn, his eyes bloodshot from the smoke and the fever, and a thick woolen blanket was draped awkwardly over his broad shoulders. He looked like a man who had fought a war with the elements and barely crawled out alive. He stopped dead when he saw them. He saw his daughter clinging to Clara like a sunflower turning toward the dawn. This was the girl who had avoided the kitchen for 2 years, the girl who had shrunk from any touch since the funeral. The sight seemed to hit him harder than the mountain wind. His chest rose and fell in a ragged breath. "You should be in bed," Clara said, her southern voice dropping into a low, commanding register that brooked no argument. "The doctor won't be here for hours, and your fever has only just broken." Silas didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on Lily, his expression a mixture of disbelief and an agony of hope that he was terrified to acknowledge. "Lily?" he whispered, his voice cracked and dry from the cold. The little girl shifted. She didn't pull away from Clara, but she lifted her head from Clara's arm and looked across the warm kitchen at her father. She saw the tremble in his large hands. She saw the raw, exposed love in his weathered face. She reached out and patted the open book on the table, the old leather-bound volume of poetry Clara had been reading from. "The green grass," Lily said. The words were small, fragile, and whispered so low they were almost lost to the crackle of the wood fire. But to the two adults in the room, they sounded like thunder. It was the voice of a child waking up from a 2-year sleep. Silas sank to his knees right there in the doorway, his strength completely deserting him. The blanket slid from his shoulders to the floor, forgotten. He didn't care about his dignity, his pride, or the hard veneer he had worn like armor against the town of Harrow Creek. Lily scrambled down from the bench. Her small boots clicked against the floorboards as she crossed the kitchen and threw her arms around her father's neck. Silas gathered her up, burying his face in her shoulder, his chest shaking with silent, heavy sobs that he had suppressed since the day his first wife's coffin was lowered into the frozen earth. "Papa," Lily whispered again, softer this time, against his neck, as if testing the shape of the word she had kept locked away for so long. "Papa." Silas held her face in his hands, unable to speak. Clara stood up quietly and turned her back to them, focusing her attention entirely on the coffee pot on the stove. Her own eyes were blurred with hot tears, but she kept her hands steady as she poured the dark, steaming liquid into tin mugs. She knew that some griefs were too sacred for an audience, even an audience of one. Spring came slowly to the valley, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes, the creek running high and cold. The schoolhouse frame went up in March, Silas's men and half the town working together, the sound of hammers carrying across the flat ground on clear mornings. Clara taught the children of Harrow Creek in the main house until the building was finished. They came every morning, 8 of them at first, then 12, then 15. Their mothers began stopping to talk. Their fathers tipped their hats. The town was changing its mind about her. Not all at once. Gradually, the way trust actually works. Gerald Holt arrived on a Tuesday in April. Clara saw him from the schoolhouse window. The hired coach, the 2 men riding alongside, the particular way he held himself that she had always found suffocating. He had a lawyer with him and a folder of papers, and the expression of a man who considered the matter already settled. She finished the lesson. She dismissed the children. She walked to the main house and told Silas. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What do the papers claim?" "Debt transfer. My father's debts assigned to me, with a repayment clause that amounts to indentured service." She paused. "It's not legal, but it's designed to look legal long enough to cause trouble." "You know that for certain?" "I spent 3 months in my father's study learning his accounts," Clara said. "I know exactly what was owed and to whom. Holt bought a fraction of the debt at a discount and inflated the rest. I can prove it." Silas looked at her for a moment. "Then we'll prove it." They met Holt in the street in front of the land office, the sheriff present, 2 of Silas's men standing at a distance that was not accidental. Holt smiled his teeth smile and laid his papers on the table outside and began to speak. Clara let him finish. Then she opened her own folder, the one she had written to Savannah for, the one that had arrived 2 weeks ago, the one she had been waiting to need. She went through the numbers line by line. Her voice was clear and unhurried. The sheriff leaned in. The lawyer's expression shifted. Holt's smile thinned. "The original debt," Clara said, "was $4,200. My father settled $2,000 of it before his death. Mr. Holt purchased the remainder for $600 and is claiming it as $8,000. I have the transfer documents, the original ledger, and a letter from my father's attorney confirming the settlement." She looked at Holt directly. "You're welcome to take this to a judge. I'd encourage it." Holt looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He simply stood there, still and unhurried, with the particular quality of stillness that had always made men reconsider. Holt picked up his papers. He left before noon. The schoolhouse was finished in May. Clara stood in the doorway on the morning it opened, watching children file in with their slates and their lunch pails, their voices bright in the warm air. Silas came to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they watched the children together. "Lily wants to come tomorrow," he said. "I know. She told me." He was quiet for a moment. "She talks all the time now. I can't remember what the quiet was like." Clara smiled. "Yes, you can." He looked at her sideways. "Yes," he said. "I can." The morning light lay across the valley, the mountains still carrying snow at their peaks, the grass below them green and new. A hawk turned slow circles above the treeline. Somewhere in the schoolhouse a child laughed. Silas turned to face her. He was not a man who spoke easily about the things that mattered most to him. She had learned to read him in other ways. She saw it in the coffee left warm on the stove. She noticed it in the fence, repaired before she even mentioned it. And she felt it in the way he always stood, positioning himself between her and whatever room she was walking into. "I didn't know what I was asking for," he said. "When I put out that contract." "Neither did I," Clara said. "When I answered it." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was careful, like something he was still learning to allow himself. "I'm not asking for a contract now," he said. Clara looked at their joined hands. Then she looked up at him. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." He kissed her there in the schoolhouse doorway, with the children's voices behind them and the spring morning all around them, and it was nothing like the careful, provisional kiss of their wedding day. It was the kind of kiss that meant, "I choose this. I choose you. Not because I need to. Because I want to." When they drew apart, Lily was standing in the schoolhouse doorway watching them with the solemn expression of a child who has decided something important. "Are you going to do that a lot?" she asked. Silas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Silas. "Probably," Clara said. Lily considered this. Then she went back inside to find a good seat. Silas kept hold of Clara's hand. The valley stretched out before them, wide and green and full of morning. She had come here with $4.30 and a ruined dress and a question that had silenced a room. She had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Not rescue. Not shelter. Not even love, exactly, not at first. She had found a place where her worth was not debated, where her voice carried weight, where a man who had forgotten how to need anyone had learned, slowly and honestly, to need her. And she had learned the same. "The South gave me life," she thought, watching the hawk turn above the treeline. "But this land, this man, gave me a home." She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back.